All right, on today's podcast, we have Joel Kotkin. Joel is the Presidential Fellow at Chapman University, Executive Director of the Houston-based Urban Reform Institute, author of 10 books, including his most recent, The Coming of Neo Feudalism, A Warning to the Global Middle Class. And he's been described as America's uber-geographer. So this is going to be a fun interview. How are you, Joel?
I'm doing fine. Thank you.
Did I miss anything there?
Well, I mean, all sorts of things, but that's certainly sufficient.
Okay. So, there's a few reasons why I wanted to get you on. You were referred to me by a past guest on this podcast, Adam White, whose opinion I always trust. And so started digging into your work, and I'm really excited for today's conversation because it seems like you've touched on a variety of topics, namely demographics and geography. So why don't we get into your new book, the Coming of Neo Feudalism, which I think is a great title. Just as broad brushstrokes, why don't you give the audience kind of a high level of what the argument is there?
Well, I think the basic point is that we're moving into an era of is certainly not, we're not seeing the rise of knights in chainmail and stuff like that, but we're seeing several things that were very much part of the medieval situation. A dramatic lack of upward mobility. In other words, people can't move up. There's greater inequality. There's greater concentration of wealth and power in this country and around the world, really, almost everywhere now. And then you also have demographic stagnation, which was very much part of the Middle Ages. And then you've got this weird kind of quasi-religious political environment, which is almost completely obsessed with one form or another of the coming apocalypse. That apocalyptic thinking was very central to the Middle Ages. So basically, we're moving into an era where the mentality and realities of medievalism hit high technology, and it's in some ways it could be very much like the sort of future that Aldous Huxley wrote about in Brave New World.
Yes, I do like that. I do like that analogy. One of my favorite books is Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. And he makes that argument that, it's not going to actually be 1984. It's going to be a brave new world. And I do think that if you look at social media, that sure seems to be our real world version of Soma, the drug that they're all addicted to keep them happy.
Or not necessarily happy, because I don't think they're particularly happy, but keeping them occupied. Clearly the tech companies are desperately interested in how to make you absolutely dependent on the media all the time, and they want to know what your preferences are and what your interests are, and then they're going to send you stuff to sort of build off that. And then, of course, there's this other very frightening thing that's really only become obvious in the last 4 or 5 years, which is that social media now beginning to act like the Inquisition and decide, what thoughts are allowed, what thoughts are not allowed. Now, we haven't started burning people at the stake yet, fortunately. But what happens is people get put into the thing I refer to as the digital gulag, where you don't exist anymore. You're basically your ideas are either, they say these are inaccurate, or you're completely taken off the media. Or what I notice, interestingly, is I used to use Google on almost every search. If it's a political issue, I now go to DuckDuckGo, just because I can see how once they've made up their mind, Google has a political agenda. I mean, it is, it's not quite the Chinese Communist Party, but it's moving in that direction. These thoughts are okay. These thoughts are not okay. These things are important. These things aren't. As opposed to the past, where it was based on what was closest to the question you asked, what was being used the most. Now it's clearly on certain issues. Now, if you go in on an issue that the nerds haven't quite focused on, you can still get pretty good results. So there are certain things where it's still very good, but fundamentally, we're seeing an attempt to limit the debate, shape the debate, exclude certain inputs that really is quite unprecedented in recent history. So the internet, which was emerged as sort of a liberation, has now become really much more an instrument of repression.
Now, in terms of the book and the central argument of the book, is that more of an economic argument? Because what I'm hearing is more of a socio-economic argument, where the neo-feudal class is really more based on class in terms of status rather than wealth.
Right. Well, I think it's both, but I think a lot of it is status. It's what's and that was very true. I mean, when in the book I talk about the two dominant classes in society. One is the oligarchs, which is basically Silicon Valley and Wall Street to some extent. And then there's the what I call the clerisy, which is academia, the media. I mean, sometimes when I'm reading media stories, and as an old reporter, I'm just horrified. They'll just say, fire is caused by climate change. Well, yes, climate change may have been part of it, but we know that there were other PG&E messed up, or the state forestry policies were wrong, and this is documented not by just lunatic right wingers, but by state agencies. And what you find is that reporters are literally, it's almost as if they get if it's on the environment, they get a press release from the Sierra Club and they reproduce it without even thinking that there could be possibly another way of looking at things. And this is where we are politically. And we're going through this recall here in California, and the mainstream media, it's almost as if somebody went to the Democratic Party and said, "Here's what you should be covering today." No, it's not. It's not a conspiracy. I mean, I think things happen because people all share the same views. So if you've got a media where 98% of the reporters have one ideology, and then if they're involved in climate or COVID or whatever the issue is, they've become advocates. They no longer really have the function that they used to have of providing information and giving the reader some leeway to organize their thoughts.
Now we can get into the details of why that is, and kind of the behind the scenes structures of the media, basically the systemic issues that drive that. But let's let's put a pin in what you're describing in your book. So I know it's the oligarchy, the clerisy, and then there's the third piece, which is
there are two other classes that I talk about. One is called the yeomanry, which is the old middle class, the small shopkeeper, the artisan, the small landlord, and these are the people who have just gotten. They were in trouble before COVID. They're in much more trouble now. And then
what's the fourth?
The fourth is the serfs, and that's really what's happening. Is we're seeing the yeomanry becoming more and more like serfs. So, for instance, let's take a middle class skilled worker living in California 40 years ago, bought a house, had a middle class lifestyle. Their children with the same level, even higher education, never will own a house. They are going to be renters for the rest of their lives, and they're probably going to have a hard time finding high wage employment also. So what we're seeing is a kind of devolution of upward mobility, whereas we had, between, let's say, 1950 and 1975, 80, there was still a lot of upward mobility in this country. That started to fade and has now taken a really negative turn. And COVID, of course, made it worse, but it was happening already.
Now let's level set though for the audience, because I want to go back to what you said right before that, which was around the media and how they cover issues. You are not a very conservative guy, right? Like, you're an old school liberal who's lived in California your entire life.
Well, I lived in New York as a kid, but I've been in California.
New York and California.
Right. Well, I lived in St. Louis briefly, but outside of that, but I consider myself sort of an old Pat Brown, Truman, and even to some extent the Bill Clinton Democrat. I mean, the Bill Clinton of the particularly after 1994, who sort of got mugged by reality and came out with policies that I think were good for a lot of people and were acceptable. I mean, what we're seeing now is something very different, which is whoever has a majority they're not even trying to talk to the other side or get engagement, or so you get this extreme very far left program backed in a Congress which is divided 50-50. I mean, we never seen anything like that. I mean, and the other thing that is also very medieval is the fact that more and more power is being done through executive actions. That's happening at the state level, and it's happening at the federal level. So, you now have the power as a county, for instance, to shut businesses down, to force people, not to pay rent, or you can force people to do things. I'm not against necessarily doing it, but it's being done by executive fiat after years. I mean, it was one thing to say for 2 weeks. It's another thing that we're going to live for years on programs that people might not approve. We see this in all the sort of the climate stuff. I mean, do you think that the average working class Californian wants to be told that they can't buy a gas-powered car after 2035? Probably not. But you do it by executive order. You want to shut down the oil industry in Kern County, California? You do it by executive order. You'd never get it through the assembly because the unions don't want it. So, fundamentally, what we see is we now elect essentially a dictator for 4 years. Obama really started this enormous acceleration of federal power, the sort of rule by decree. Trump did something very similar. And now we have Biden, who is essentially ruling by decree. And so the whole democratic system is being undermined. And where I see the parallel is in my background was in classical history, and the Roman Republic, the late Roman Republic, had all the symptoms of our republic: growing dictatorship. You had a very corrupt Senate, and you also had the sort of small farmer, mechanic, artisan Roman citizen who was really the one who really filled the legions and all that, replaced by a professional army on one side and also by slaves. So essentially, if you erode the middle class, and then you have this sort of the clerisy and the aristocracy that arose in the latter part of the Roman Empire, and the parallels are just too painful to avoid. I mean, they're very, very difficult. We're in a very difficult period where we're repeating many things. Now, maybe 30 years from now, 40 years from now, the republic may still have its form, remember, the Roman Republic still had its form well into the imperial era. There was still a Senate. There was still we sort of they play acted at being a republic, even when it was a dictatorship. And I think that's kind of the direction we're moving in. And by the way, that dictatorship could be from the right or from the left. I mean, it's, right now we're in this period where we oscillate. So we get extreme repressive politics in California, and you get another version of repressive politics in Texas. I wish we could get rid of both of them.
It is crazy how the United States, and I think a lot of it does have to do, it is a product of the media environment, but how much power has been vacuumed, whether, officially or just, surface level, pageantry wise, to the executive. I mean, this whole notion that the Center for Disease Control now has the authority to stop evictions. So to say that contracts by two willing parties in the United States are now null and void, which was started under the Trump administration.
Right.
And then the Biden administration tried to continue it. I mean, that's, the mission creep doesn't even begin to describe that. To say that a few people in a nondescript building in Washington, D.C. can tell a landlord in Rigby, Idaho, that they can't evict their tenants is just antithetical to the American experiment. I mean, this country was founded on overthrowing the crown. So,
and it was founded also on the principle of federalism. And, for instance, if San Francisco wants to make everybody wear, a mask outside, it's stupid, but okay, let San Francisco do it. Don't say everybody's got to follow certain, the same rules everywhere. And I think that the great advantage of America has always been that there was always someplace else you could go where you could find more opportunity, maybe more freedom, or a social climate that you wanted one way or the other. If you really want to embrace lunacy, move to Portland, and if Portland wants to destroy itself, okay, within some limits, you let that happen. You don't have a situation where you turn the entire country into Portland so that Portland doesn't seem so weird. I mean, we're sort of allowing enormous amounts of power to go to these agencies. You think about what the Fed has done with, just throwing money out so that big surprise, we get a massive inflation, a ridiculously overpriced stock market, ridiculously overpriced housing. And this is not being done because the Congress passed a law and there was debate. It's done by executive. And so we're really, and this was one of the characteristics of the decline of the Roman Republic and then through the empire, which is that more and more, power from the central bureaucracy able to do whatever it wants.
I mean, one of one of my favorite presidents, Grant, one of his big decisions was bucking his own party on expanding the money supply,
right? Which
was, a decision made by representatives of the citizens, and now it's just made by, one guy basically entering in keystrokes into his computer. Hey, we're gonna print more money. Obviously, that's a little bit of hyperbole, but yeah, it's totally removed from people, and it's one of the most important things. I mean, you came to the right place because this is a podcast. I've done multiple episodes on debt, the federal debt and deficit, something I've personally cared about for a really long time. And this is also a pro Bitcoin podcast because people need somewhere to opt out to. Because if your dollars are just going to lose 7% a year, where else am I going to put my money? Especially with what you're talking about, the neo feudal class. Not everyone can just go buy equities.
Well, I mean, and of course, not only could not everyone buy equities, but when to buy them, how to make money on them, And of course, the real money is made by people who put in $100,000 or more into a startup company that is vetted by the same venture capitalists who've made money on the same companies. I mean, one of the things I find just really disturbing and very feudal, if you will, is the fact that, when in the old days in Silicon Valley and during the tech booms of the 70s and 80s, there was a lot in Silicon Valley, but it was much more dispersed. There was tech companies being formed all over the country, particularly in places like Texas. There were all these different nodes. Now it's become such an insider game. These are all the same people, the same names, the same investment banks, the same venture capital firms, the same serial entrepreneurs over and over and over again in the same location. And this is probably one of the weirdest parts of it. Half the tech workforce in Silicon Valley is not American citizens. The vast majority of those are indentured servants. There are, in other words, people that they come in from India or the Philippines or China. They work for a company for 2-3 years. They can't change jobs. They don't get paid as much as Americans. So what we get incredible amounts of wealth concentrated in few hands and not a lot of opportunity for people, for American citizens, whatever their ethnicity, to rise up with these companies. So, fundamentally, we're creating and accelerating the class divides through government policy. Certainly, the lockdowns have accelerated this as well. And I think that the reality is we are now further from being a democratic society and a society where there are restraints on centralized power. That is almost gone now. And what's scariest to me is that we now accept the idea that Facebook and Google can essentially demonetize and now we're talking about banks demonetizing people they don't like. Like you recently, one of the bank of General Flynn. Look, I don't have any particular liking for Flynn, who was one of Trump's advisors, but the bank saying we're not going to give you credit anymore because we don't like your politics. What type of country are we becoming? And of course, what nauseates me the most is when I see these companies who say, "Hey, we know we're gonna have ethical lending." Meanwhile, we're going to do business with China. We're going to support people, put people in concentration camps. We're going to support a country that now produces more GHG than basically the entire first world put together. That represses Hong Kong, threatens Taiwan, and I'm being told that the Wall Street investment bankers are holding up to a moral standard. I mean, these people are sickening and disgusting, if I can put it mildly. I mean, it is unbelievable. And again, it's kind of a medievalism, because if the Catholic Church in those times said, well, having sex out of wedlock is bad, but if the local feudal lord goes in and takes his right to have relations with the daughters of the peasants, well, he can be forgiven because he just gave the church X amount of money. I mean, I can tell everybody they've got to live incredibly austere life in the future, particularly your generation. Oh, by the way, but I'll fly to the climate conferences in my private jet. You have to live in an apartment, but I can have 16 houses. I mean, it's the hypocrisy is so amazing. And in order to maintain hypocrisy, you have to keep people in a state of fear and ignorance. And that's what social media is doing. And by the way, I have no particular positive things to say about right-wing social media either. But the thing is, the right-wing social media doesn't have the institutional power that the mainstream media has. And it doesn't have control of the platforms that the big tech companies have.
Right. Uh, the hypocrisy thing. I mean, it's almost by design. It's meant to basically, poke someone like you and say, I dare you to call me out. I dare you to put this, because it's so obvious. It's so in your face. I mean, look at there's a million examples, right? But the one that comes to mind is the Major League Baseball All-Star game over the voting law. Is, not only did New York State has more restrictive voting laws than the Georgia did. That was one piece of it. Secondly, a lot of the kind of like hearsay around that bill was just wrong. I mean, there was all this talk about like, oh, you can't give people water or something like that. And then the specific provision was like, you can't be, someone who works for a party who give them water or whatever. And this is like the brilliance of it, right? Is now you're debating, well, so should we be allowed to give someone water? Doesn't matter. Like if you're going to vote, like you could probably just get hydrated before you stand in line. Like there's no agency of the voter to just like bring a water bottle or something. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And then thirdly, they move this game, and then who does it hurt? It actually hurt all of the local businesses in Atlanta, which is a predominantly Black city, which, they're purporting to support around this voting law. And then they move it to Denver, which is clearly a more a whiter city. And they just hurt all these businesses. And that's why you saw like a lot of the local leaders. I think Stacey Abrams at the time came out and said, actually, we don't want to move this game. But there's a million examples like that. I mean, you hit the nail on the head with like Disney and China. It's just not to be taken seriously, but it's just so in your face. It's so overwhelming. As we record this yesterday, the Met Gala happened last night.
Oh yeah.
And, there's this picture of AOC in the Tax the Rich dress, which was apparently $1,000 dress. And then right behind her, and she's not wearing a mask. No one's wearing a mask. And then right behind her, you want to talk about the serfs, like there's literally like 10 people who are working the event, and they all have to be in masks, and they're not wearing $1,000 dress. Apparently tickets to this thing are like $30K. I think that honestly, she's just as good at eliciting a reaction that she wants to as Trump was, which I think was the brilliance. And I think a lot of people on social media just took the bait. But when you talk about the hypocrisy of it all, I mean, it's just so in your face. It's so overwhelming. I don't know what to do about it, right? Because there's only so many times you can call it out. And if it's just relentless hypocrisy, then I don't know.
Because you have to understand that this is very much a medieval mindset, that your betters do not have to live by the standards you have to live in, because in some sort of way, well, they're doing God's work. If Jeff Bezos gives $10 billion to the Greens and then goes and spends more energy going into space than we all spend in our lives, what does he care? And the problem is that that what will happen is AOC will do this, the conservative media will yell and scream, and the mainstream media won't ask a question. I mean, so what we see is we've moved even from a idea of there being even debate about issues to, essentially one side has this set of beliefs and one side has that set of beliefs. The biggest difference is that the right-wing media, outside of the Wall Street Journal and Fox, and talk radio, is pretty toothless and has relatively little power. I mean, if you consider the fact that CNN, the New York Times, the LA Times, even a lot of the reporting in the Journal, though that's still halfway decent, but almost all the networks, they all have the same ideology, the same worldview. You think about, to me, the most outrageous case of all, to me, was like the Hunter Biden laptop and suspending the New York Post, the oldest newspaper in America, not because it was inaccurate, not because anyone could prove it was inaccurate. It turned out probably to be accurate, because they didn't want Trump to be reelected. Now, look, I didn't want Trump to be reelected either, because I think he's a lunatic. So but basically what we did is we we traded a doddering, we got a doddering president instead of a lunatic. That's what amazes me. When we were a fledgling country in the 18th century, we had more intelligent leadership than we have in a country of well over 300 million people. I mean, this is what we have. And of course, what we have, again, it's so reminiscent of what happened to the Roman Senate at the end of the Republic. Such mediocrities on both sides. I mean, it's hard to even find anyone you would respect. So, what you've got is the Republican institutions, if you will, small r, are getting weaker, and the executive functions and the corporate elites are getting more powerful. That's basically what's happening. And it is in the interest of the corporate elites to have a dominating federal government, because the more regulation, it's harder for the entrepreneur to get ahead. But if you're, let's just say we put a bunch of regulations on social media. Facebook will be able to deal with it. Some schmuck trying to start a business is going to have a harder time. It's like if you're if you're a big company, you can deal with you now have to have this number of women and this number of gays and this number. Well, if you're a gigantic company and you can pick off the best candidates, but what happens if you're a startup company and you need to put on your board people who actually contribute to the business? You're in a much harder situation. I mean, the more sort of strictures that are imposed from the top, whether from the corporate top or the executive part of the government part, the more it empowers the wealthy and the powerful and weakens the entrepreneurial and the upstarts.
Yeah, complexity is absolutely a subsidy. That if you have the money to afford the attorneys and the accountants to deal with all that stuff, that is absolutely a tried and true strategy of a mature company to basically regulate out your competitors, make it harder for them to upstart. I mean, that's exactly what's going on with Facebook. Facebook for the past 3-4 years has been on an all-out lobbying blitz. If you read any of the trade papers in DC, you see they're advertising everywhere about pushing legislation for, I don't know. I mean, it's all spin. It's all BS of we're helping a free and fair internet, or however they try to, spin it. In reality, what they're trying to do is make it harder for any competitors to start up. And so I think that's totally in line with what you're talking about. I mean, that's exactly what the oligarchs are basically paying off the clerisy, to use your terms, to make sure that the yeomanry cannot get a foothold there. And exactly what you're talking about. I mean, real businesses in Youngstown, Ohio, or Brownsville, Texas, are not worried about these obscure regulations. They're worried about meeting payroll. Currently, they're worried about getting people on their payroll. There's this huge labor shortage, which the media is not covering at all. And you see it everywhere. You can't drive down a street, at least where I am in Texas, without seeing, it's almost comical how often the minimum wage for the new jobs is increased. It's like on Tuesday, it's, we're offering $20 per hour for, a new line cook. And then you drive on Wednesdays, $23 an hour. And of course, they just can't find people.
And the tragedy is, I think higher wages is great, but the tragedy, I think, is that there is what's the best way of putting it? The real problem, I think, is that people have higher wages, but the inflation is greater than the higher wages.
Right.
I mean, that's whatever you might say about Trump, the last 2-3 years of Trump's administration did see the first real wage increases after costs that the working classes had in many, many years. that's been completely reversed. So what you've got is you've got a labor shortage and higher wages, but inflation that's so high that it essentially wipes things out. Particularly when you start looking at the price of food and gas and rent and mortgage payments, the things that are kind of essential. The price of a car, the price of a used car. And so we're having this kind of, again, I think it's an acceleration of the movement towards what I call neo feudalism, that the pandemic has certainly helped. And I think if we get where we're headed now with the current plan, if it passes, is we're going to end up with a gigantic welfare state. The middle class will end up being essentially wiped out to pay for this huge welfare state. The welfare state will prevent the peasants from getting pitchforks and attacking the houses of the oligarchs. And we'll have a kind of stagnant society controlled by a very small number of people. My call is I want to see the middle class stand up and say, no, we don't want, this is not the society we want. We want a society where our children can go to school, learn a skill, and get a job and own a house and have a family, that we can continue to move as a society. And that's not where we're moving now. Where we're moving now is extremely low birth rates, very low marriage rates, more and more people stuck renting for the rest of their lives. And of course, Wall Street and the progressives both like this, because the progressives don't want homeowners, because the homeowners might actually vote differently than renters might vote. And Wall Street likes it because instead of you having a house and enjoying some sort of asset increase in your value, all the profits go to the people in Wall Street. As you said earlier, my politics are not libertarian. They're not conservative. They're not Republican. They're kind of old line Democrat. And the problem is the old line Democrat is becoming a endangered species.
Yeah, I mean, it really sounds like what you're after is good governance. Is to begin with is the simplest thing to ask for. I do think that federalism, doubling down on federalism is probably the answer. I want to give somewhat of an optimistic picture here because this is getting a little bleak, but in order to achieve the pluralism that you were talking about, I think that increased federalism, and it's already happening, right? Because during the Trump administration, they would do something, and then all the blue state governors would say, "We're not going to comply. We're going to sue." Blah blah blah. That's exactly what's happening right now. I mean, the vaccine mandate from the Biden administration saying, through OSHA, we're going to coerce these businesses to make sure everyone's vaccinated. All the red state governors said, "See you in court." So that's already happening from a practical level. I don't think necessarily that is what we're thinking of when we really think about the principles of federalism. But in terms of the day-to-day politicking of the country, I think that's already happening. But let's shift gears here towards the end of the conversation. How did the pandemic reshape America's geography?
Well, in a funny way, what the pandemic did is, first of all, it devastated what you might call the analog economy. In other words, the store, the
world of atoms.
Right. And like, for instance, and it also empowered the chains. For instance, as I remember talking to an East LA shoe store owner, he had to close, but his clientele could go to Target and buy shoes. It was good for Walmart. It was good for Costco. It was good for Target. It was good for some of the more well-positioned food chains. Like if you go like to Chick-fil-A or Cane's or In-N-Out Burger, any of those, they were very, very strong on having their what I thought was pretty effective on online ordering, delivery. So essentially what it did is it wiped out a lot of up to a third of all American small businesses will probably never recover from this. Meanwhile, the chains got stronger. On the real estate side, what you're going to see is that real estate, let's say a small landlord who owns a couple of buildings in South LA, they're going to lose those buildings. They're going to have to sell them to a investment bank who can survive without rent for 6 months. Whereas the small owner who maybe that apartment was their retirement, they got to get rid of them. So what it's done is it's accelerated the consolidation of wealth, and of course has been an enormous boon to Amazon, to Facebook, to Google, to Microsoft, because we were forced to do things digitally more, and now that's become the new normal. And in the new normal, a lot of the analog economy is in serious trouble. A lot of the immigrant businesses, the minority-owned businesses, are in trouble. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, and I'm not going to make a judgment what's right, what's wrong, but states that were a little bit less strict, their economies came back much stronger. They have lower unemployment rates. I mean, you take the state of California, Disneyland was closed for many, many months after Disney World opened. Those were thousands of people who didn't have jobs. Now, what we've done in California and to some extent nationally is we've put all those people on the dole. So instead of working, they're on the dole, or they're getting this subsidy or that subsidy. Now, look, I think that may make sense in some senses, but are we creating a society, which again, to go back to my Roman analogy, where the Roman citizen lived on bread and circuses? They didn't work anymore. They just got bread from the government. And at one point there were 200 festival days out of 365 in Rome. So you keep people occupied. That's where we're headed as a society. We're not putting a priority on home ownership, on starting businesses, and of course, look what's happened today. There was a very excellent essay from Mike Malone, who's been covering Silicon Valley for about as long as I have, actually. And he made the point, he said, it used to be people had the ambition, I'm going to start a company and it's going to become the next Apple, the next Google, the next Oracle, whatever. Now the idea is I'm going to start a company, and if I can find a niche, Facebook will buy me, Google will buy me, Microsoft will buy me. How many standalone platforms are left that are significant? Not very many. And so, fundamentally, what we're doing is we're seeing the consolidation of wealth, power, influence, control of information in ever smaller number of hands. Now, if you want a hopeful thing, there are many, both on the left and the right, who understand this can't go on. And the problem is that these tech companies, as you mentioned earlier, have so much money that they're throwing it at lobbying, for instance. They're able to create a situation where they essentially own both political parties, or enough of both political parties. I mean, you think about it. The most influential newspaper in the nation's capital is owned by an oligarch. I mean, just start there. More and more of the big Time is owned by an oligarch. The Atlantic is owned by an oligarch. Obviously, Bloomberg is an oligarch. Other words, this control over the flow of information, as well as the wealth to influence decision making, is really some of the important stepping stones towards a neo-feudal society.
Well, there's a term we have on the show for the control of the flow of information. That's the narrative monopoly. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Let me actually push back on one specific point there, which I would say, the M&A activity from the FAANG companies, I actually think is a great thing because it gives these companies who may not scale to IPO size, who have raised venture dollars, they don't really have another option if their business model is basically built on scale, but they can't get to the launch velocity of an IPO. Having that ability to sell to one of those companies is actually, a win-win for all the employees and the investors.
Well, I would doubt that. One, it's a win for the investors and probably for the founders. But wouldn't we be better off if LinkedIn was owned by somebody different than a giant oligarch company? You think we'd be better off if WhatsApp was an independent company? WhatsApp was going to do fine. Do you think it's great that YouTube is controlled by Google? Essentially what you have is this narrower and narrower channel. And yes, the individual entrepreneur, but in terms of jobs, I would say, for instance, here in Southern California, here in Orange County, we had Oculus. It was an independent company. It was in Orange County. It was hiring people here. It was creating a basis for an industry here, because gaming is a very big deal here in Southern California. And now it's part of the Microsoft monster. The jobs, first they went to Silicon Valley, then they went to Seattle. I don't necessarily think that this is certainly not good for Orange County. It wasn't good for anyone who worked for Oculus who lived down here. The consolidation of that power means, yes, if you can find a niche and you can sell it to one of the FAANG companies, yes, you can make a lot of money. I don't think you build real companies. One of the things that was interesting about, and by the way, why the pace of innovation is so slow. In the 80s, when I covered Silicon Valley, there were always competitors. There would be 45, 50 disk drive companies, and eventually it would go down to 2 or 3. But the pace of innovation was so much greater. Think about it. Microsoft software is no better now than it was a decade ago. It's basically designed to, they seem to put their effort in how can they get a piece of the social media advertising income, the surveillance income, if you will. The products aren't necessarily much better. It's astounding to me. Google, I think, is worse than it was because it's been so politicized and because it has no competitors. You do not get productivity and technical enhancement when you have a very limited number of players. There's a reason why cars are more efficient and cars are better designed, safer, get better mileage, in part because you've got 10 companies out there in the world fighting it out. We don't have 10 companies fighting over search. We don't have 10 companies who are significant in social media. So, yes, it's a short run for some, young guy who got a venture capital investment. That person will do well. Will they develop a Hewlett Packard out of that? Will they develop an Intel out of that? Will they employ thousands of people in this country? I doubt it.
Yeah, I agree with your central argument around how these companies are working both from an information flow standpoint and almost vacuuming up capital standpoint, to put it in a very rough terms, of creating this neo-feudal class. But I would have to disagree on these specific points here. I think with Oculus, that the founder of that company, Palmer Luckey, he went out to create Anduril, which I think within 5-10 years will be a public company and compete with these big the primes in defense.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, but I think that we are in a situation where it's really very hard to build a competitor company to the existing oligarchs. You can build, basically what we see is like you get the Uber, the Lyfts, you get you go into a analog niche, and of course, but one of the big differences is if I'm Uber and Lyft, I can lose money for 10 years because I can play the stock market. I've got the venture backers. I've got the PR machine. The average schmuck can't do that. We would be so much better off if every city had its own Uber and Lyft. They'd have the same technology. Why do we have to, basically what's going to happen is we're going to get this huge surge in prices so that they can pay off their investors. I mean, that's really what's going to happen. So, I think that what we're seeing is a system that benefits the few, benefits the rich, benefits the connected, and screws everyone else. And that's neo-feudalism.
That is a great way to wrap it up. Where can people find you?
I have a website, www.joelkotkin.com.
I'll link to that in the show notes.
I also own a website called newgeography.com, which covers a lot of these issues.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Joel. I really appreciate it. I think this is going to be a good one.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Bye.